My name is Nooriz Khamis. I am VP Technology at CloudSpark Labs. We develop Teams apps for many organizations. One of the ones that we've developed for our customers is the Content Explorer app, which we've actually open sourced for everybody to use for free. Let me just give you guys a quick spiel. We only have about 10 minutes, so I actually want to get into the demo of the app. And Jose on the line is one of our senior developers on the product, is actually going to demo it for you and go through some of the source code as well. So let me just quickly start by talking about why we developed it. So as we go on our project side and the consulting side of the business called CloudSpark, we deal with a lot of customers now, and especially during the pandemic, we're finding that it's very important that we keep Microsoft Teams top of mind when we're developing an information architecture, right? So whatever you're doing in terms of document management, collaboration, SharePoint, site collections, modern site collections, classic, you name it, you should have Teams top of mind, because that's where everybody is working 70 to 90% of the time, we're finding. And going from a browser to Teams and to a different apps, it's really frustrating for users to switch contexts. So that's kind of one of the reasons we created the Content Explorer app. Because document management and collaboration within SharePoint may not always reflect the way your organization and your teams are structured. And as we know, when you create a team, there is a SharePoint site created on the back end. It doesn't mean your files are going to be stored there, especially if you guys are already a structured and organized in the way your company works from a document management standpoint. We don't want to restrict the users and the organization to leverage the SharePoint site that's backed by the team. We want them to be able to point to any of their document management site collections on SharePoint Online or SharePoint On-Prem. So we want to, and that's going to really help from a end user productivity standpoint, because some organizations have already created this whole information architecture, a site structure, a navigation structure, all of the stuff that's important as part of information architecture. We want them to leverage what they've created and to be able to use the teams that might not correlate to those site collections. There's a lot of capabilities that Microsoft has given you with Teams out of the box, which are going to help you from a productivity standpoint. So things like being able to expose your document libraries within the tabs of your teams, to use the add cloud storage capability with the files. What we did was create this Content Explorer to be able to point to any site collection in your SharePoint Online sites that you have, and being able to show all of the libraries and the lists and all of the capabilities there in a security trimmed manner, so that you only see what you have access to within a tab within any team. And now not only can you point to any site collection that has subsites, that has all your library structure, and you can view it in a flat manner, or you can view it in a hierarchical manner. So if you're not on modern yet, you could point to a classic based site, and it'll show you all the subsites and such. You can browse through them. Or if you're already on modern, then you can actually point to a hub site, and it will show you all the hub attached sites that you have as well. So in either a flat or hierarchical manner. So that's a really cool app that we built that our customers seem to love. And one of the main reasons we built it was so that it would work with on-prem, because there's a lot of hybrid companies out there that are on a hybrid environment where they're using an on-premise version of SharePoint, and they've already have their structure. They spent years and years on developing that site structure and the information architecture, and their team structure, which is online, may not directly reflect how they've done their document management. So kind of the premium version of what we've created connects to the on-premise environment. The free version, which Jose is going to show you now, is actually available for everybody to download, and we've given that for free, and you can enhance it. And that's where I'm now going to pass it off to Jose to give you a quick demo.
All right, thanks, Rez. So what I'd like to do is show a few different things. The first of which is a quick demonstration of the Content Explorer in action. I know you've seen some screenshots, but we'll go kind of walk through it, just so you can see firsthand how the app works as a Teams tab. And then after a brief demo, we can explore the in-app settings available that allow us to configure the view presented to the end user. And lastly, with a better understanding of how the app works, then we can take a look at the code base. So let's begin by navigating over to our Content Explorer tab. After loading, the first thing we're going to see are the lists and document libraries for a given site. In our case, we are looking at the About site collection. We can see this site collection in SharePoint right over here. And so I have a couple of document libraries, company info, etc. Some of them are right out of the box. So importantly, this site collection is a hub site. Now we can select a given library and navigate to its contents. This now links us directly to the library in SharePoint. So what we're seeing now is a SharePoint page for the contents of the chosen document library. If we wanted to open a file, we can go ahead and click on it. We'll open up a new window in SharePoint for file editing. So let's close this down and let's go back to our Content Explorer screen. Now, the strength of this solution is not so much that we can display a site's lists and libraries within Teams. I think that's pretty fundamental, but actually that we can now allow the user to find content that they will need when that content is spread across different hub sites and associated hub sites. For that, we can use our dropdown to see a listing not only of our About site, but its associated hub sites. So here we have resources and FAQs. If I click on resources, we can see now the view kind of uploads. It shows the list and libraries for our resources site collection. So this is the true benefit of the functionality that we've coded here. But before we take a look at the code itself, maybe we could spend a little bit of time looking at the tab settings that are available. So I'm going to go ahead and click on our tab and click on settings. We can see that our Content Explorer requires a given site collection URL to function. This is where I'm pointing it to. We direct all our service calls to retrieve the lists and libraries from this endpoint. Additionally, we have the ability to show or hide the types of SharePoint lists and libraries. Perhaps the user doesn't care maybe about site pages or style library, and we can deselect that. And that will hide them in the view. In addition to hub sites, we also have the ability to display the contents of a subsite of a given site collection. And finally, we can alter the kind of layout that a user can see for the hub site and its associated sites. Right now, we have selected a flat presentation of our sites, but we can change this to grouped and go ahead and apply. So now we see our sites are grouped together by the hub site with which they are associated. So I can go ahead and obviously use the functionality that comes right out of the box with Fluent UI. So now that we have an idea of what the app does and how we can configure it, let's turn our attention to how this was coded. So I'm going to head into Visual Studio Code to see our source files. Minimize these just to give you a better idea of our structure layout. So as an overview, we see we have a web part file, but we have also divided our app into components, constants, helpers to prepare the data being sent to an API or coming back from an API, our interfaces for our type data, and our API services. Importantly, as we've already seen, we're leveraging Microsoft's Fluent UI component library to get the look and feel and functionality to match Microsoft services. But first, let's take a look at our web part file, which we're already in here. Here is where we set our rendered component. In our case, it's the My List app. And we pass in all our web part properties that we need. We saw these in the settings panel for our web part. Now, this is foundational to SPFX Teams tab development, so I'm going to skip ahead to our side of the code. So as mentioned, we are rendering the My List app component. So let's go take a look at this component. All right, so I'm going to head down to the render method because we see there's nothing really fancy going on here. We're displaying a site selection dropdown. We're displaying a details list, And this happens when the user has a flat layout, so when it's not equal to grouped. And alternatively, we just display a grouped list, which is our own custom component, when they select grouped. So our site selection component is really our dropdown. Now, this is sensitive to whether we're displaying normal site collections or a hub site with associated sites. Now, based on what site we select in the site selection dropdown, we call our SharePoint API to get the lists and libraries to be displayed in the Fluent UI detail list. And for this, we just call the SharePoint API to get SharePoint lists and libraries. This type of call is pretty fundamental to the SharePoint API. So again, I won't be spending time on this. Instead, let's focus on how we get our site selection component to get a list of hub sites and their associated sites. So let's turn to the site selection component. So our work here is really done in our services call, which we'll see shortly. But our site selection component here is the first thing is that it mounts and it tries to load up all of the sites that it can get. And our load sites here, as we can see, is we want to first get some site information. In particular, that's going to be important to us is this site a hub site? If it isn't a hub site, then we're just displaying a normal site collection, and then we go and get the lists and libraries. If it is a hub site, however, then we have our magic call to get our associated hub sites. So let's take a look at our get associated hub sites in our service call here. This call is pretty important in that it's not using a SharePoint API or the normal SharePoint API endpoint to get this information. We are actually first having to get a hub API token from the SharePoint Home API. So here, we get an API token from our SharePoint Home Service API. And from this token that we get from calling the SharePoint Home Service, we are able to retrieve a secondary SharePoint Home Service API endpoint, which allows us to then retrieve all of the associated hub sites with a given hub site ID. And this will then retrieve all of our hub sites, all of the child or associated hub sites, as well as their subsites. So this is where kind of the magic happens. And then they're kind of retrieved in no particular order. So I have a helper function that prepares this data in the structure that I need. I have hub sites as kind of the root, and then I have associated hub sites underneath those, and then subsites underneath those. So that's the crux of the functionality here to get our associated hub sites. Once we've finished this portion, then it's just a straight call to get lists and libraries from the SharePoint API. So that's my brief overview of the code base and the functionality for the Content Explorer.
Yeah, Jose, do you mind clicking on the link that Hugo posted on the chat so that everybody could see where to get this source code?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. And so here we have a link to our source files. And so we should have the exact same structure as we just noted. We have our components, constants, interfaces, and the last thing I showed you was our SharePoint service calls in here. So this is all available to download for you to test. Great.
Thank you so much, Jose. Thank you, everyone. And then we'll pass it back to you, Dana.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that demo.